Welcome everyone to our two-part series on Georgia in post-New South era and building towards the Great Depression and the causes of the Great Depression. So in the New South era leading up to the Great Depression, we know that Georgia is kind of trying to diversify their crops, and because they're very dependent on cotton. But during this process of trying to diversify and change what crops they grow, they are struck with disaster. The first disaster being the boll weevil, an insect that would lay its eggs inside the cotton plant and eat the cotton before the cotton even had a chance to bloom. It destroys about 2/3 of Georgia's cotton crops in the early 1920s, putting Georgia in a depression, an economic depression, even before the real Great Depression hits. In addition to the boll weevil are the droughts of the 1920s. It just does not rain for almost the entire 1920s, the latter half of the 1920s. And so you see here it says that in 1925 you could walk across the Chattahoochee River because you see how dry it is. And so these two agricultural factors really hit Georgia hard, because Georgia, even though after the Civil War begins to industrialize, that's still just in the major cities, not out in the rural areas yet. So those rural areas have this agricultural hit. They're not able to grow crops, they're not making money, so they're in an economic Great Depression before the real Great Depression even happens. In addition, they're trying to revitalize their farms and buy some new farm equipment, such as the motorized tractor, but because they're losing so much money because their farms are destroyed because of the boll weevil or the drought, and there's no rain and no crops are growing, they can't afford to buy the new equipment. So again, making the farmers, when they're trying to improve and do something to better their lives, well, other disasters make it impossible. So many farmers begin to move away from the rural areas of Georgia and begin moving into the cities, moving into Atlanta, moving into Augusta, moving into Macon, moving into Savannah. And these areas begin to grow and industrialize even more, but the industrialization gets to a point where there's just no more jobs, and there's so much migration to the cities that these farmers move there and they don't have jobs, so they don't have money, and they're homeless, and so causing more depression in the rural areas of Georgia, and now it's spreading into the cities. So the Great Depression. Like I was saying, the Great Depression occurs in Georgia long before it occurs across most of the rest of the country, in the 1920s. Now, there is economic disaster across the country in 1929 with the stock market crash, which triggers the rest of the country going into the Great Depression, but Georgia's in the Great Depression from the early 1920s, so about 10 years before the rest of the country at this time. And it lasts until about the late 1930s, and we'll talk about later what gets us out of the Great Depression. But right now, let's just look at what caused this economic downturn, and probably the most severe economic downturn of our country and even the world. It spread across the whole world. And, we had some, pretty bad economic times over the last 10 years or so, but nowhere compared to what happened here and what society was like during this time period. It was the worst economic downturn in history. Banks go out of business, businesses themselves close forever. A fourth of all Americans are unemployed, and even though Georgia farms were struggling, now almost half of the country's farms are struggling due to the Dust Bowl that goes across the Midwest, which we're not going to talk a great deal about, but it does cause a lot of problems across the country for other farmers too. So here's some images that you see from the Great Depression. people sleeping on newspapers, homeless. The photo right down here, this is what's called a Hooverville, from President Hoover, who was president when the Great Depression began, and his just lack of help for people. There wasn't a lot going on. He tried, but what he tried just didn't work. And the lines of men standing outside trying to get, jobs, get, coffee and donuts up there on the sign you see, but they're really hoping to get a job or maybe just something to eat for the day. All right, so multiple factors kind of contributed to the Great Depression. There was this unemployment cycle. So people don't have a job. So you see the cycle just kind of goes around. When you're unemployed, you spend less. You're not able to purchase as many products. You just don't have the spending power that you had before because your wages are lowered. But industries are creating more products at the time. And so, there's all these products out in the market. A company makes 100 shirts, but society can only afford to buy 50 of those. So those other 50 shirts that this company has made go unpurchased, and the company loses money on them because the people don't have jobs, they don't have the spending power to buy those shirts. So then the company starts to go bad, in addition to the people already having lack of income. So the company loses money, they lay off more workers, then there's less spending power in society. So because wages are so low at this time period, people begin to buy on credit. Well, credit at this time was different than it is today. It wasn't quite the same as a credit card is today. But they couldn't afford to pay anything back. They were buying things that they needed on credit, but they had no money to pay it back, and so they ended up being severely in debt. The United States was also had loaned money to some struggling European countries after World War I, and they were placing high tariffs on European goods, making it difficult for those countries to repay their loans, because the European countries would have to pay a high tax to bring their goods into the United States, and they couldn't afford the tax, and they couldn't afford to repay the loans that the U.S. had made to them. So the U.S. government's not able to get revenue and money back into the country. Then many people began to do what was called over-speculating on stocks. It's kind of complicated in a way, but I'll try to make it as simple as possible. Say a stock cost $5. Your hope was that it was going to go up to $10. And so you would try to speculate that the stock was going to go up to $10, and you would sell the stock at that kind of higher price and then have to repay the difference. But when the stock market crashed, people owed so much money in those differences that they couldn't afford to repay what they owed. And so they were borrowing money on stocks, hoping that they would go up to these higher prices. But when they never went to the higher prices and they just bottomed out to just pennies, then they had to repay that money, but they didn't have the money to repay it. So the stock market crashes. Anybody who had money in the stock market is completely bankrupt because they don't have the money to repay back what they had borrowed, speculated on the stock. Okay, so these are the quiz questions that you're going to see on Edmodo, and I will be posting these, and it will be fill in the blank like this, and you can go back to the notes if you want to, of course, and get your answers, and it will check it for you, and you will know your grade on Edmodo as soon as you complete the quiz. As always, if you have any questions about anything, the Great Depression is kind of a little bit of a complicated process, but make sure you understand what the 4 major economic factors were that resulted in the Great Depression for Georgia and for the rest of the country. And if you have questions, ask in class, come in and see me in the mornings, and we'll talk about it, and I'll help you out.